I know that there are a few people still trying to find a seat or a space to stand, which is absolutely fantastic. But I think we want to start because we want to have as much time as possible, not only for questions, but to give the speakers some space. Just to let you know, Lesley has got to leave pretty sharpish. She is chairing a Nordic Horizons event about Brexit, so she's going to need to leave as soon as she's finished speaking. So I'm going to speak as little as possible before that. Welcome. It is utterly fantastic that we have filled this hall on a beautiful Saturday morning. I'm Sally Foster-Fulton. I'm the new head of Christian Aid in Scotland, and I've been asked to chair this event. There are just a couple of housekeeping issues before we go. Wanted to let you all know that all of the events at the Radical Book Fair are free. And if you'd like to leave a donation, you're welcome to at the door when you're going. At the end of this event, the authors, except for Lesley, who's got to go, will be available to sign books. So if you leave that way and come around into the book fair, that would make things a lot simpler. We'd also ask that you turn off mobile phones. I just remembered to do that about 2 seconds ago. This morning's event is so timely. We are in a time of incredible transformation. And so the time for business as usual and status quo is not this time. This morning is about thinking outside the box and gathering our collective wisdom together to make big changes. I was told just before we began that it's a tradition of the Religious Society of Friends, the Quakers, to let people speak for themselves, for their words to be what you hear and their actions to be what you see. And so I'm not going to introduce at length our speakers, but I'm going to let their words speak for themselves and their actions speak for themselves. And then when you leave this place, go and do the same thing. Speak up, act out, make some big changes. Tax is not a burden. You don't need a haven from it. You don't need to evade or avoid it. It is our contribution to each other. So we've got to figure out ways to radically reshape the way we do tax, to shorten and bring together that gaping hole in inequality that we see in this country and across the world. This morning we have 3 speakers. Lesley Riddoch, speaker, journalist, author of Blossom, mover and shaker, and activist. She is constantly on the go. And as you know, in about 30 minutes needs to be out the door. And so I'm going to let her words and actions speak for themselves. Lesley.
Thanks very much. I'm sorry about the old double booking. Slight attention to detail problem on my part. But some of you may know there's a big event today for Nordic Horizons, which I helped run, which has got people from all the Nordic countries actually talking about the different ways they relate to Europe. And probably it's kind of timely then, because this first section, I think I was not normally in the scheme of things going to be the first speaker. But actually, since I'm the one that can't count, I'm going to be the easy way in for you in a morning about tax. I'm speaking about sort of Nordic dimension to all of this, and perhaps standing back a little from the kind of nuts and bolts to some of the kind of philosophy that underlies the way that the Nordics work things. I was reading, I don't know if anybody else has had this experience, when you co-edit a book, it can be some time before you actually read all the chapters. Or have I just given away some huge academic secret, right? But anyway, I only got round to reading some of the chapters in a book I co-edited called Nordic Neighbours, which had a very interesting observation about the fundamental difference between the Nordic way of doing everything and the British way. The Nordic way is that the market lives in society, and the British way is that society lives in the market. And now I can sit down. Because actually, when I read that, it was another of those things where you feel as if someone's actually just punched your solar plexus, because you actually realise how wrong the wrong way round we've managed to get everything, and not in a superficial way, but in a very, very deep way. Most people will know that the Nordics famously pay higher taxes, but that's just sort of one aspect. It's, of course, always easy to pick one bit of the deal out. And as Sally was saying at the start, I'm not apologising for the idea that you get high tax. But there's a number of things that a high tax sort of regime, if you like, relies upon. One is trust. You need to trust, if you're paying high, any amount of tax, that the contribution you make will not end up being squandered on things like nuclear weapons. There's no point. The degree to which the British government has broken trust with taxpayers over decades has almost eroded our capacity to pay tax confidently. Because, who in this room would pay more tax at the moment to see it wheak away off down to Westminster to fund the kind of priorities that the government we didn't vote for over and over and over again wants to spend on? And actually, that's another aspect of the way things are different, because the Nordics also, in their version of the state and their destination for most taxation, is not like us, our central government. It's not a long intestine, if you like, of funding, where money goes away off to some superior authority for them to decide how much should come to the little Parliament of Scotland, and for them in turn to decide how much will go to, I'm not calling them local councils anymore because they're regional councils, and have a complete void at the local level. That way round, that sort of, it's a horrible analogy at this time in the morning, but that's sort of, going through the intestines of the entire procedure, or let's just call it feudal. That feudal way of paying tax is unknown in the Nordic countries. I can remember the first time I had a discussion about this in Sweden. Someone was explaining to me that everyone who earns less than £35,000 a year pays all their tax directly to their local municipality. And that municipality has probably got a population of around 14,000. The average size of a Scottish council is 170,000 people. So, right at that point, you see one of the most massive differences. When he said that basically everybody in the room would be paying tax directly to their municipality, the only way the Swedish government is funded is through corporation tax, business taxes, and higher rate taxpayers. So most folk come straight to the municipality, and I was surprised. I appreciate you don't look very surprised, but it's early. You are an Edinburgh audience. But anyway, I was visibly surprised since I come from Firth of this parish. I think I may have uttered the idea that was weird. And then the guy said, so how do you fund your local services? And I thought, I wish I hadn't even started this. I had to explain this ludicrous way that we fund ourselves. And he said at the end of it, right, you think we're weird? But then he said something far more profound. He said, don't you trust yourselves? Because 90% of all services are delivered within about 5 miles of your front door. And yet, the say-so for it and the funding and the taxation all goes away off in an enormous loop before it comes anywhere near you. And I'll never call our system of councils local again, because they're not. So that actually gives another reason why trust is low. We had a 38% turnout at local government elections. That's how connected people feel to the so-called local governments. And that's another break in the trust that you need to be able to pay taxes with confidence and have some idea that you can really see the people who are spending it. And you'd better believe that the folk who run the municipality in these Swedish areas would have people on their case every day they go shopping. That's the kind of connectivity you need and direct access you need to have the trust levels that allow you to pay tax with confidence. There's a question as well of what those councils do. I mean, just again, taking Sweden, there are 92 local energy companies in Sweden, which mostly are branches of each local municipality. Their aim is to supply district heating so that there's a minimum of waste and people don't freeze in countries, a third of whose territory is in the Arctic. And shamefully, old people and others will die this winter again of hypothermia, which is unknown in the Nordic countries, for the reason that so much is taken on by councillors. They are muscular little manifestations of the state. Whereas at the moment, the SNP are taking more and more powers away from regional councils that are unloved, without fixing the structure that causes the problem. So all of this sort of relates. Quality of services, they're top banana. One of our speakers at Nordic Horizons, Professor Ljungqvist from the University of South Denmark, put it memorably. He spoke about 2 years ago, I can still remember this. He said, our aim is to have services which are attractive for the affluent and affordable for all, so that maintains social solidarity and everyone pays for welfare. I mean, this is the nation that invented Lego, and it is kind of that simple. These are the building blocks of society. And if you don't have good services, if it is, as it is in Britain, a very poor, means-tested, unfair set of safety nets for the very poor, you will eventually end up fractioning everybody's desire to contribute. The aim there, and it's been very successful, is to have very, very high quality services that are used by everybody. And for those of you who've had experience, you'll see that that's true. The Swedes have the best old folks care in the world. The Swedish consul here, a lovely guy, Torvald Colliander, who's gone back to Sweden now, took me once to see the old folks home in Ängelholm in Skåne, where his mother had lived for a while and died. And it's fantastic. She moved most of her furniture in. It was a tremendous facility, and it was council run. And the fear everyone has in Sweden is of not getting into a council-run old folks' home. And when we left, Torvald showed me the register in which his name sits. Because when it comes to the right time, he'll be going there as well. How different. I mean, you know about standards of kindergarten care across all the Nordic countries, and the fact that children aren't pushed prematurely into school at the age of 4 and 5, as we do here. Only 12% of the world puts kids to school at that age. They're all parts of the former British Empire. Yet again, that's not an issue that we are currently reconsidering at our Scottish Government level. But that, again, that excellent childcare is a product of paying your tax. And when you're beginning to get excellent services like this, it is a lot easier to pay tax because you see the results of it and you're not having to opt out and double dunt. How many people here, secretly, embarrassedly, or whatever, are having to make separate, private arrangements for something because the system simply doesn't cater for it? That's not something that happens there to any great extent. And that, again, is one of the things that makes a higher taxation threshold work. There is an aim of equity and solidarity stated unequivocally at the heart of most of the Nordic countries' political parties, but also some of the founding laws, effectively in the 30s particularly, that set up this kind of system, much of which was actually borrowed from our own. And beverage was much admired in the Nordic countries, it's just they did it. But the aims of equity and solidarity are incredibly strong, and that's why the countries in the world with the smallest income gap are the Nordic countries. If you've been there, I can remember, I've noticed myself, most times I go, if you're in a shop or if you're in a cafe, you keep thinking you must be talking to a student because that person speaks excellent English, they're pretty perky, they'll have a joke with you, all the sort of things that suggest someone who's not sitting all the time in a job that might be precarious and low paid. And then you discover actually that is their job, but they're just not low paid for it. They're paid a pretty reasonable whack. So you begin to feel the difference in the way that people relate and the degree to which people have fitted around their lives as much leisure that works for them as possible, which again is an optional extra in British and Scottish society we have carved off. But I remember on one occasion standing in Helsingborg in Sweden, being shown again by Torvald, who was, if any of you knew him, relentless about recycling. So he'd taken me, this is the kind of days out I get, to the largest recycling dump in Europe. And we stood on the edge of it with the guy who ran it. And he said, breathe that in, smell that. I thought, okay. And so I did take a pretty deep breath in, no smell. He said, that took us 3 years. 3 years, no smell. The way we tested, Henrik Larsson, the former footballer here, lives a mile down the road. If he gets the smell, he tells us. But the impressive thing about this was I was trying to interview this guy, Kim, who ran that facility, as we stood on the edge there, and it started to rain. And as I sort of thought, actually, we're going to have to stop this, suddenly out of nowhere, an umbrella appeared, which actually caused some strange sound effects, but nonetheless, it let us keep going. At the end of it, I turned to thank the person that had just so thoughtfully come up with the umbrella and discovered that it was actually the mayor of Helsingborg, and she was just all too chuffed to help. Now, this tells you something about the lack of hierarchy that comes with, the lack of massive differences in income that comes with an explicit commitment to equity and solidarity. Behaviour changes. People don't see it as, that's not for me. Can you imagine a provost in Scotland coming to the rescue with anything? Because they've got their gongs of office. They're somebody. That's the way Britain works. It's all about rank, title, and top-downness. And that, in that direction, it's very hard to see for many people why you'd want to pay more tax, except that that kind of equity that comes from a different tax base is what creates the sort of society you want to live in, not one you just want to watch on television, like, you know, many of the Downton Abbeys and these kind of series are very popular in the Nordics. It's like watching dinosaurs, except we're living with those dinosaurs. So all of that, I suppose, is part of what shapes this different experience. And it came from a period between the wars and just after the Second World War, when all the Nordic countries, in their different ways, made the kind of accommodation in a big, permanent way that allowed a shift of resources and a redistribution and an aim of equity. I should say the final plank of all of this really is a social contract, which means that trade unions are actually bolted into the way that the workplace operates. And that creates a different sort of feeling as well, because most decisions that are made incredibly cooperatively. Helsinki Council, for example, which has been run for, I think, the last 30 years by Conservatives, surprisingly enough, has no opposition. Everyone who's a member of the council has a position and has a responsibility. It creates a very different way of operating, but of course that's dependent on having had proportional representation for the best part of a century. But again, these structural things that are so dry and boring, although not to you, because here you are at 10:30 in the morning on a Saturday, but these structural things are the things that give the goods that other societies like ourselves that seem to be terribly worried about that structural change want to sweep up like kind of low-hanging fruit without going through that icky bit of actually changing the structures that create the good society. And you can't do it. I think probably the reason that many people here are on the yes side when you look at our constitutional status is that we realise you can't do it unless you take control and change a lot of structural things. But to me, this is where tax fits into all of these aspects of society and is far more possible once trust is gained. The trust levels in the Nordic countries are the highest recorded in the world, and that is not just between citizens and government, but between citizens themselves. And the reason for that, again, I think, is because the municipalities and the power, the budget and the services are all being decided upon and delivered so locally that you know what your fellow person is capable of. They're capable of being part of a muscular little 14,000 municipality that runs your life. It strikes me also that if you don't have that very small groundedness, it's very hard for people, as it is in Scotland, to see how people who are not judged competent enough to run their communities can nonetheless be competent enough to run their country. So an awful lot of things to me sort of hang together. And that question of trust is absolutely paramount. There are higher levels of trust recorded in Scotland than anywhere else in the UK. But you know something? A lot of the time when we hold that kind of comparison to us, we're simply trying to protect ourselves from the knowledge that we're all bumping along in the gutter together. And if you wanted to raise your head and see across our latitude at the kind of results that a country as energy rich, people rich, knowledge rich as we are should be achieving, we're not actually firing on all cylinders at all. And I think we can't undo that until we start to plug in the power to control taxation right at local levels that mean something to people and take that great risk, as it seems to be being perceived in the current government, of trusting people. Thank you. Sorry.
Lesley, thank you so much. So much to think about. Sometimes I just want to go, give me a minute to let it go down where it is. But we need to move on. So a huge thank you to Lesley, and go well with the Nordic Horizons event. Our next speaker is Richard Murphy, academic political economist, who proposes radical changes in our tax system. And he's written a great book called The Joy of Tax. I like it. He's also a chartered accountant and founder of the Tax Justice Network. Richard, come and share some thoughts with us.
I'm wondering how I could follow Lesley. That's a challenge. The Joy of Tax. Do you know, my students don't understand the title. They're too young. Which I find quite funny. David Cameron did, which was also quite amusing. It was a book that was, if I'm completely honest with you, waiting for content for a long time. The title was created with the assistance of a bottle of whiskey several years before the book followed. Well, that's life. What is the joy of tax? I think there is one. I really believe in tax. That's how I ended up as possibly the only radical chartered accountant in the UK. You try mixing those words together. The joy of tax is that tax has the greatest power to shape the society we live in over anything else we've created. That's what its great ability is. We can change things with tax. But if we're going to do that, we have to really understand what tax is. And that's the fundamental purpose of the book. Because for hundreds of years, we have believed, you've heard it throughout your lives, that we tax and spend. I've got to tell you, that's wrong. If there's one message I want you to remember this morning, it's that we spend and tax. I want to show you the example. I could do with it with Scottish note, but you'll understand why I won't do it with Scottish note in a minute. So I'll use an English one instead. That's what the national debt looks like, by the way. Anybody here want to get rid of the national debt? Please leave all of these at the door and I'll take them away for you. 63 billion of the UK's national debt looks like that. It's notes and coin. Most of it note. And it's debt. How do I know? Because it says on it, I promise to pay the bearer on demand the sum of £10. Now, admittedly, if you go to the Bank of England and ask to be paid your £10, they'll give you another identical note, because that's all they are. They're just a promise, but they are a promise to pay, and that's debt. But that debt has a very, very special purpose, because that's the only thing you can pay your tax in. You can turn up with dollars and try and pay your tax and you'll be turned away. No, thank you. We want pounds. That's what you must pay. So I'll tell you, what comes first? The classic chicken and the egg. Did that come before tax or did tax come before that?
Tax came for the Romans.
No. That's a historical answer. I'm talking about an economic one. You had to spend these into existence before you had a £10 note or a £20 note or whatever it is to pay your tax. In other words, the spend comes first. Governments spend money into the economy. That's how we have it. And do you know what happens when you pay your tax? I'm going to show you what happens when you pay your tax. Right now, very graphically. That's what happens. It's okay, Tesco's take them when they're sellotaped together. My 14-year-old son is an expert at sellotaping notes together. Always gets them right. He demands a commission on it though. I have this fear he might end up a capitalist. You never know. But that's literally, you've just learned everything there is to know about tax. Government spends money into existence, tax cancels the money they spend. Now that is a radical idea, but it's part of a radical economics revolution that's going on now. And very briefly, I'll explain the other part of that. Because for 320 years, economists and bankers believed that you had to have money in a bank before you lent it. And in April 2014, I and some others, we worked for about a decade on this, persuaded the Bank of England to admit, no, that's not the way banking works either. Banks create money by lending, and deposits, that savings, arrive because the money is redeposited after they've lent it. In other words, banks need no money to lend. They make it up, they print it electronically, just as governments print this stuff. I mean, that's just printing, isn't it? Look, even when half of it is printed. And we make this stuff up, we believe in the money, we deposit it in banks, we collect it as tax. But it's always, lending comes before saving, a complete, total revolution in banking theory. And now we need a total revolution in taxation and government spending. How do I know governments can spend without taxing? Because we've done it. Every day, if you listen to Robert Peston on television, Robert and I have a long history with each other, dating back to Northern Rock. He got the story of Northern Rock, I got the story of its shadow bank, Bradley. So we've had a little rivalry ever since. Every day, if you hear something like him speaking on television, they'll say, UK government debt is over £1.5 trillion. 12 noughts on the end of trillion, by the way, just for those who aren't familiar. I used to account in pounds, and now I can't think in less than billions. It's very strange. But they say it's 1.5 trillion. No, it isn't. At the moment, it's 400 billion less than that because of quantitative easing. Quantitative easing, I have to get used to that number of T's in that when I start saying it out loud. 3 T's in a row is an odd word. It's an unusual thing. It's literally the government rebuying its own debt. That's what it is. It's the Bank of England buying the Treasury's debt. But who owns the Bank of England? The government owns the Bank of England. So therefore, the government owns its own debt. If you owe yourself money, it doesn't matter when you repay it. It's like your left pocket repaying your right pocket. Or it's like a husband and wife having a joint bank account and saying, I owe you 100 quid, they write a cheque from their bank account to their bank account. Does it make any difference to the amount of money in the bank account? No. That's exactly what quantitative easing does. We've done 400 billion of it. This year, Philip Hammond is going to say we're running a deficit. Now, officially it's going to be around 60, actually it's maybe as high as 80, but whichever it is, over 60 billion of government debt is going to be repurchased by the Bank of England this year. Now, if the deficit is really 60 and the government repurchased 60 billion of its own debt, do we have a deficit? We didn't borrow anything. At the end of the year, we have exactly the same national debt as we had at the beginning. We didn't cover 60 billion of spending by tax. We simply covered it by money printing, which is what quantitative easing is. So we don't need to tax to spend. Now, that is the most radical and liberating idea that I can offer to you this morning. It is fundamental to what we're talking about, creating a just Scotland now. Earlier this year, I had about half of Westminster's SNP MPs come to a briefing with me in Parliament. I was a bit surprised that half turned up. If anybody's ever done a briefing for MPs in Parliament and you invite people along, you expect to get one MP. And I didn't. I got about half the SNP membership there, which was astonishing. And I said, you ran a great referendum campaign apart from two things. You got your economic policy wrong and you got your currency wrong, but everything else was great. And I sat and listened, and it was true. Because Scotland can only be free if it has its own currency. Because if you haven't got your own currency, you can't print your own money. And if you can't print your own money, you have to balance your books because you owe somebody else who created that currency the money. But once you've got your own, you can tear it up. You can do what you like with it. It's yours, you're free. And you can therefore run your own tax system. And therefore you can run your own fiscal policy. You can run deficits to boost your economy. You can run your own monetary policy because it's your money. So you can set your own interest rates. And your tax policy isn't designed to balance the books, which is the most boring accountancy exercise of all time. And I tell you that as a chartered accountant. And everything that Monty Python said about accountancy is true. I promise you. That's why I gave it up 20 years ago. Being an academic is much more fun. Being a campaigner is much more fun too. But if you don't have your own currency, you haven't got this liberation to manage your economy. And when you manage your own economy, tax becomes something fundamentally different. Why you tear it up is because if you didn't, of course, if you kept on printing money, you would get inflation. Now, some of you will know that a year ago, Jeremy Corbyn tried to adopt me. I didn't sign the adoption papers. And so I'm not now the author of Corbynomics by a long way, but apparently I was for August 2015. I discovered that I was the author of Corbynomics. It's a very strange experience to discover you're the author of something. Because they phoned me up on a Tuesday and said, would you come and speak at the launch of his economic policy on the Thursday? And I said, yeah, but why? You know I'm not a member of the Labour Party, no? And they said, well, it doesn't matter. But why are you asking me? They said, well, have you seen the policy? And I said, no. Would you like to send it to me? And I discovered 70% of it had been borrowed from my blog. This was an interesting experience. And so I spent the summer defending it and then discovered that he abandoned it when he got into office, which again was an interesting experience. But what I was trying to persuade them to do was believe in this power to reform taxation. Taxation's purpose is not to fund spending. Taxation's purpose is to end inflation. The fundamental macroeconomic purpose is to ensure that we don't get inflation by overprinting government money. So because we can print as much money as we like, but we would end up with inflation if we didn't tax. So macroeconomic terms, that's why you have to do it. That's why you have to coordinate. And this is something which nobody's put together in a UK context, which is very interesting in what Lesley said. Nobody has yet worked out how we will coordinate local government collecting tax with central government collecting tax with this overall objective of controlling the balance of inflation. We've done it by centralisation. Margaret Thatcher did that in 1980. She destroyed the power of local government to borrow. She destroyed the power of local government to set its own rate. And she undermined local democracy as a result because she believed in monetarism. Nobody, me included, has yet come up with a theory of how we devolve that power again. And I believe it's one of the great challenges of thinking in radical economics at the moment, is to work out how to rebalance that. But inflation has to be cancelled. But once you understand that, that's all that tax does. It cancels the money that government spends. Then you realise there's a second element to tax, and that is the delivery of social policy. Because it's not funding spending, it's cancelling inflation. But the way you cancel inflation means you have to integrate tax in your social policy. So if you're a radical, you want to redistribute income and wealth. Of course you do. Why? Because countries with less inequality are richer. They're not just fairer, they're richer. And the reason why they're richer is that people on low income spend more of their incomes than people with lots of money. By definition, people with lots of money haven't spent it. It follows like night does day, doesn't it? You're rich because you don't spend. Therefore, if you want to actually get your economy going, you take money from the rich and give it to those who are going to spend it, and the world goes round a bit faster, which is precisely what you're trying to do. So redistribution creates growth. So we want that. Growth is not a dirty word if it means people are empowered to do things. I am also an author of the Green New Deal. I understand the ecological limits to growth. I'm talking about empowering people to live their lives here, not to destroy the planet. And tax lets us reprice market failure. As an economist, I'll tell you, markets don't work very well. I know most of my colleagues think it does, but actually at City University, where I'm now a professor, we have two departments of economics. We have political economy, which is on the 5th floor, and we have economics, which is on the 3rd floor. And October is a very interesting month, because our students have a month to decide whether they want to change their course when they arrive. And October is arrival month. And loads of students who sign up for economics walk up from the 3rd floor to the 5th floor and say, can we do political economy, please? Because that involves thinking and writing essays and actually analysing and trying to find answers. And economics is purely about solving some sums about what is the optimal allocation of resources inside a fantasy world where Homo economicus lives, where everything is perfect. Complete fantasy stuff. And we've never had anybody go from the 5th floor to the 3rd floor. Markets are imperfect. We know they are. Alcohol, tobacco, carbon, you name it, they don't work. So we have to correct for it. Tax does that. And tax does something else which is very important in the context of what Lesley said. Tax is what I would call, if I'm going to be a legal jargon here, the consideration in the social contract. Yes, I believe there's a social contract in society. There is a contract between society, state, and individual. We do live in community. And tax is the glue that holds that together. And there's quite a lot of evidence that if people don't pay tax to a government, they don't bother to vote. The tax that matters is not VAT, it's not any form of local taxation, it's income tax. Now, if you read the Daily Telegraph, I wouldn't recommend it, but if you did read the Daily Telegraph, you'd know that the only tax that matters is income tax, because they frequently say 30% of all tax is paid by 1% of the population. That, of course, is not true. 30% of income tax is paid by 1% of the population. The overall rate of income tax on the wealthiest is, however, smaller than the overall rate of indirect taxes, like VAT and alcohol taxes and everything else, on those who are the poorest in society, who have the highest overall tax rate. But the point is that people who pay income tax, for some reason, I can't explain the psychology, believe they have a stake in government. That is why local income taxes may well be important. It is why turnout is so low. But it's also, the research has been done in many developing countries. When people pay tax, they believe they have a stake in government, they demand accountability, rates of corruption fall, rates of involvement in government rise, democracy flourishes, and so on. Where you have oil states where they can live entirely on oil revenues and they don't have to involve anybody in the process of paying tax, you have basically got other forms of non-democratic government. So tax is this consideration in society. Now, if you put those elements together, we then end up with something which looks very different. Now, there's lots of stuff in the book about how we transform the tax system. I haven't got time to talk about that. And there's lots of stuff about how we beat tax cheats, because I hate tax cheats. Why? Because tax cheats, well, they're cheats. Anybody here like a cheat? No, I didn't think there'd be many volunteers for that either, any more than you volunteer to leave your national debt at the door. But people don't like cheats. They don't like free riders. But that's exactly what they are. It doesn't matter whether they're avoiders or evaders. One of the things we learned in campaigning was we had to actually get rid of that division. We just call them cheats, it's easier. Because they all are. They're all trying to get round the law. None of us like people are going to free ride on the back of us. But it's fundamental that we beat them. So if Scotland's going to have a good independent country, it not only needs its own currency, so it can run its own economy, it needs a strong tax system, which beats cheats, which also means it will have to invest in a strong tax authority. But strong tax authorities are actually about underpinning society. Westminster doesn't believe that. That's why they're sacking tax inspectors as fast as they can. We've halved the number of tax inspectors in the UK in a decade. And apparently we have a problem with the national debt. But we actually sack the tax collectors. Why do you do that? Only if you want a national debt, because that lets you impose austerity. If you don't want to impose austerity, you have your tax collectors. But we want to get rid of the tax cheats. Because actually beating tax cheats is the thing that you can do to let business flourish. Businesses need a level playing field on which to compete. They all need to be able to sell on the basis of the quality of the goods or services that they supply and what decides whether somebody will buy from them. And we will end up with a mixed economy. I don't believe most people believe we will end up with anything other than a mixed economy. Well, certainly in my lifetime. I imagine in the lifetime of my children. In which case, we've got to provide a strong platform in which only the honest businesses, those who are also the ones who invest and create jobs and employments and apprenticeships and training and everything else, have the chance to flourish. But when the tax cheats, instead of flourishing, none of those things happen. So this is a very strong pro-business agenda, it's a strong society agenda, it's a strong equality agenda, it's a strong independence agenda. Scotland needs tax justice. It needs it very badly. And there is a joy in tax, because that's the foundation of a strong society.
Aren't you glad you got up early? Thank you very much. We've had two different visions. We've had the vision of what might be in Scotland based on experience in other countries. We've heard from Richard about a different way of doing tax and how vitally important it is that we begin to think outside the box. We are at a pivotal time in this country, with more tax powers coming to Scotland, with the threat of Brexit very real and impending. And so we now have Andy Wightman, who is MSP for Lothian, who is on the Commission of Local Tax Reform, who looked at alternatives to the council tax, who's written 3 books, Who Owns Scotland, Scotland's Land Power and Agenda for Land Reform, and The Poor Had No Lawyers. Deep thinking, deep action. So Andy, we look forward to hearing what you've got to say. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sally, and just to add my hearty welcome to your talk about tax on a Saturday morning. So I've been asked to speak about sort of land and tax, and I just want to start by defining what we mean by land reform. It's about changing the relationship between society and people. That's fundamentally what it's about, and that relationship takes many forms. It takes 3 principal forms. The first is a legal relationship, and that's the relationship that people living in the private rented sector have with their landlord. It's the relationship that crofters have with their landlord. It's the relationship that tenant farmers have with their landlord. It's the legal relationship and distribution of right, the nature and allocation of rights to the legal system. The second relationship is a fiscal relationship in terms of what are your obligations, duties to pay fee, in essence, for the privilege of occupying land. And that will be the subject of what I'll talk about over the next 10 minutes. And the third one is a political relationship. And that's to do with the fact that as a society, we have views on how land should be used. So we have a regulatory system in environmental law to stop people polluting land. We have a planning system that says that we as the community shall determine how land shall be allocated for different uses, because that affects everybody. And ultimately, it's a political relationship because the very laws that underpin the ownership, occupation and use of land are made in a political environment. And that's why when I meet landowners who challenge me on the idea that we should reform the laws that govern their ownership of land and say that this is my land and you have no business in interfering with it, I say, well, it might be your land, but it's our law. And it's very, very important to understand that. And that's the principal reason I wrote that book, because most of the law that does underpin it has been made by landowners way before the franchise and way before half the population got the vote and way before the Scottish Parliament we had a Scottish Parliament to make the laws of our own country. So the vast amount of law that underpins this has no democratic legitimacy. Now, of course, it has because it's in the statute book, but I hope a lot of it is not on the statute book for much longer. Now, getting back to land and tax. Land is important in the tax system for many, many reasons, which I don't have to cover. One of the most principal ones is it doesn't go anywhere. It's actually a very simple thing to tax because it is visible and it doesn't move. People move. People, even if they don't move, can shift their money to offshore tax havens where it's difficult to trace. You can't do that with land. But the fundamental thing about land is that land generates economic wealth. And it generates that through economic rent, which is probably not something anyone in this, or most people in this room, know about. But economic rent was a fundamental feature of the thinking of the classical economists going back to Adam Smith. And John Swinney, it's not John Swinney anymore, it's Derek Mackay, who's Finance Secretary in the Scottish Government, very fond of articulating Adam Smith's 4 canons of taxation: proportionality, certainty, ability to pay, and... But what was interesting, and they used this to defend changes, for example, to the income tax system, or to oppose the idea that we should tax property more because it's not related to your ability to pay. The important thing to remember about Adam Smith is Adam Smith wrote A Wealth of Nations when there was no income tax. Income tax hadn't even been thought of. The idea that anyone should have to pay the state in any form, any money out of their earned income was simply something that hadn't been considered. And it was only 20 years after that the first income taxes were introduced in the UK, as I recall, I think, to pay for the Napoleonic Wars. And income tax was so controversial, that it was limited to 1 year of statutory authority. And that's why even today, if the Finance Act in Westminster in the UK Parliament is not renewed by the 5th of April, no one has to pay any income tax. There is no statutory permanent obligation to pay income tax. Anyway, economic rent is the return after you have paid, after the return on labour and invested capital. And that surplus has been capitalised and is one of the reasons why the distribution of wealth in the world is growing more unequal. It was at the heart of Thomas Piketty's analysis of inequality. It's principally down to the housing market. It's why when Tony Blair came to power in '97, one of the first things they did was set up the number 10 policy unit and look at future trends in inequality, and they discovered that by 10 years' time, those who were becoming an adult in 2007 would, for the first time since the Edwardian period, be poorer than their parents. That's quite a shocking indictment, and Tony Blair knew that that was going to be pretty damning legacy. And the choice the incoming Labour government had was, shall we do something to tackle this because it's structural, or shall we not? And instead they swept it under the carpet. And that report I still want to get hold of. And one of the key reasons for that growth in inequality was housing and inheritance. And the fact that a substantial portion of the population would inherit quite significant wealth, and a very substantial portion of the population, up to 40%, would inherit virtually nothing. And I illustrate the importance of land and tax through a story about a fire in Glasgow. There was a huge fire in Glasgow a few years ago on Morrison Street at the south end of the Kingston Bridge. And there was 20 fire engines and lots of police, and the roads were closed for several months. And I'm a kind of sad geek when it comes to these things. So when I had assured myself that no one had died or been injured in this fire, because that would have been a bit tasteless, I inquired into who owned the property. And it turned out to be owned by a company called Strabane Properties Limited, based in Belfast. And they bought this empty industrial building. It was an old co-op warehouse. They bought it in 2003. It was empty when they bought it, and it was empty 10 years later when it went on fire. They'd done nothing with it. And so I then went to the Scottish Assessors portal, and I looked at the valuation on the valuation roll. And the valuation was, as I recall, something just short of over £2 million a year. That's the rental value of the property for the purposes of the non-domestic rate. Now, the rate of the non-domestic rate at the moment is 48 pence, so let's just call it 50 pence for ease of arithmetic. And so just over £2 million is the rentable value of this property. You'd be assuming that the Strabane developments would be paying £1 million a year to the City of Glasgow Council. Except that they weren't, because in our wisdom, and it's not their fault, in our wisdom, we've chosen to exempt empty industrial buildings from non-domestic rates. But the consequence of that is the Glasgow City Council's got £10 million less, or £1 million a year less than it might have otherwise. But it didn't stop Strabane Developments Limited expecting the fire brigade to come out and put the fire, the police to maintain public order, the courts to be available to adjudicate on any disputes or insurance or liabilities, whatever, and ultimately the Army, the Navy and the Air Force to defend the country against foreign invasion. Because one of the first things that invading armies often do is they go and they burn the land registry. Because if you can destroy people's rights to property, you have substantially increased your authority, your ability to exert authority over the territory you've conquered. So the first, if this, I think Richard was giving you one thing to go with, one thing I would ask you to go with is the privilege of having a monopoly over occupation rights of probably most people in this room, a very modest piece of Scotland, has to be paid for, in my view, by a fee to society for the services that society provide in upholding your rights, in providing you with a court system so that when you've got disputes with your landowner, your landlord, your neighbour, if it goes on fire, or whatever, to pay for the Scottish Parliament to pass laws to protect, to improve the law on the repair of common property and make sure your property is properly repaired, etc. That costs money, and property and landowners should be obliged to pay a fee for that. Now, I'm particularly interested in this topic, obviously, because I've been working for a quarter of a century in land reform, but also, as Sally said, I'm no longer on the Commission on Local Tax Reform. It's been wound up, but I served on it for 18 months. It was designed as a cross-party effort to deliver to the Scottish Parliament before the May elections some kind of ideas in which the parties could get together on reforming local taxation. It's proving somewhat controversial, and I'll come to that in a minute. But I just want to clarify, first of all, what is actually devolved to the Scottish Parliament in the way of tax. We now have the rate of income tax and the thresholds are devolved. The personal allowance is not devolved, but we can increase the personal allowance by a zero rate if we wanted to. Aggregates, levy, air and passenger duty, landfall tax, land and buildings transaction tax are all devolved as well. And something that's often forgotten is that every single local tax is devolved, and we can create new local taxes because Schedule 5 of the Scotland Act reserves tax in general terms, except that which has been devolved, like income tax thresholds, but otherwise reserves tax. For things like the recent Supreme Court, the Court of Session ruling on minimum unit price of alcohol, they said the Scottish Government does not have the power to introduce an alcohol tax, which would be an alternative, a poorer, but an alternative way of inhibiting the consumption of alcohol. And they're correct, the Scottish Government does not have that power, the Scottish Parliament does not have that power, but local taxes are all devolved. We could create any local tax we like. You could have a local alcohol tax. Now, I'm not advocating it because it would be even worse than a national one in terms of its administration, but we could have that. And one of the areas, for example, I'm arguing we should have it in, is the fact that if you look at HMRC tax figures, you'll see that it's about 14 or 15 billion pounds a year tax foregone because we choose to exempt main residences from capital gains tax. So when you sell your house, you pay no tax at all on the gain you make. Now, the price of that is 18% capital gains tax rates now, Richard? 18%. something like that.
Well, it depends on your.
20%,
Yeah.
whatever about that, 18%. So exempting people from paying 18% of a capital gain for money they haven't earned, unearned income, costs us, if you like, £14 billion a year. And that's £14 billion a year that could well be put to better purposes. But it is actually not 14 billion, but probably about a billion in a Scottish context, a tax we could introduce at a local level. There's no reason why the City of Edinburgh Council can't have capital gains tax. There's no reason why the City of Edinburgh Council can't have a tourist tax, which is common if you travel across Europe, Paris and Prague and Berlin. You will find at the bottom of your hotel bill €1 or something per night. So what have we done with these powers, both the ones we've got in 99 and the ones we've been inheriting? Well, I think we've done extremely poorly. One of the things I've realised since being elected in May is that the Scottish Parliament is massively underperforming. We've got the potential now to transform some key areas of domestic affairs, and one of these is how we do tax. We've got 5 years to do this. This is the first time the Parliament has known at the outset it's got 5 years. 5 years is a decent chunk of time to push through transformative change. There are 51 new members, and although a lot of them are Tories, they're very nice, pleasant Tories, but there are new members, and new members bring new perspectives, new ideas, and they challenge conventional thinking. And I'm already working with 1 or 2 Conservatives on some interesting ideas, because if we're going to make progress in the Parliament has no overall majority, and that's critical. We're going to have to work across the chamber with other parties of various configurations. It will have new powers, and there is no overall majority. So in the last session, when, for example, non-governmental organisations wanted a change or were advocating a particular policy, if the SNP agreed with it, then that was no problem. Ministers knew that when they walked into the chamber, all the votes were in the back. They whipped their members through. If they didn't pick up your policy for whatever reason, you might as well forget about it. This time round, if the SNP don't like what you propose, come and speak to us. If we don't particularly like it, we like most stuff, but if we don't like it, go and speak to Labour. If they don't like it, go and speak to the Tories. You could even speak, there's 5 Liberal Democrats you could speak to as well. And the point is that any one of those can act to try and cajole the others. And this, I believe, is going to lead to a more productive session. Now, we do need to transform our policies we have. We've done very poorly in this. When land and buildings transaction tax was devolved, for example, that's the stamp duty on property, we should have abolished it. That was the clear conclusion of the Mirrlees review into the UK's tax system. You simply should not tax transactions. If I want to move from Edinburgh to Glasgow and I have a house, don't inhibit me. Yeah, I mean, the economy is going to be improved by me moving from Edinburgh to Glasgow. It's going to be improved if there's oil in the wheels and people being able to go to where they want to work or whatever. And if you say, well, you've got to pay a 7,000 or a 10,000 fee to do that, that inhibits the economy. So we should have just scrapped it and wrapped it up in local property taxation. But the biggest challenge and the biggest disappointment has to be council tax. I mean, where to start? We put an awful lot of work in the Tax Commission. I threatened to resign from the Tax Commission and then towards the end threatened to submit a minority report because it was just going nowhere internally. I don't want to talk about some of the politics of that, but I might write it up in a year's time. And the interesting thing is when I threatened to produce a minority report, the arithmetic of it was actually going to end up as a majority report. And that would have been a bit embarrassing for the government. So they conceded a little bit, enough for me to stay on board. And so what we produced was by no means a radical set of suggestions, but it was a dramatically improved set of suggestions from the first draft. And the first recommendation was that the present system of council tax should end. It took us about 2 nanoseconds to get to that conclusion. And we thought there'd be cross-party support on that. So I and many other people have been incredibly disappointed at the SNP's proposals in April to retain the council tax. The freeze is going to end. That's good, but it's cost us £3.1 billion, that freeze, and that's come out of general taxation. That's come out of the Scottish Government. It's paid local authorities not to increase council tax. And as we know, as Richard indicated, the taxation rates for the poorest 20% are somewhere in the region of 35, 38, 40% of general taxation because they pay much, much more in indirect taxes like VAT, alcohol duties and all the rest of it. In the top 20%, it's only about 35%. They pay less in the top 20% than do the. So if you take money from general taxation, it's even more regressive. The county tax remains regressive to this day, even after the Scottish Government's proposals. The band A will probably pay about 9% of their income. The top band will pay about 2%. The bottom band will pay about 7% of the property value. The top band will pay about 1% of the property value. This is coming to a vote this week, and all I would say is watch this space. The Scottish Government's also reintroducing rate capping. Lifting the freeze is one thing, but introducing a 3% cap. This is what Margaret Thatcher did in the early 80s. Richard mentioned this. The Rates Act of 1984 was a statutory restriction on the freedom of local government to increase the rate of domestic rates. Now, I wouldn't be so critical of the Scottish Government if they were going to be honest and impose this 3% cap as a statute, introduce a law saying that local government must not increase its tax by more than 3%. That would at least be honest and principled. But they're not. They're going to do it through the way they've always done it, which is in private deals with the Convention of Scottish Local Authorities, twisting their arm and persuading them to accept it. Otherwise, they'll claw back money. And that's no way to run a mature democracy. Other elements of tax that have been highlighted in local tax over the years. I did some work in Northern Ireland, and as part of that was looking at Denmark. At their local tax system, and discovered that they all pay the green tax, the local land tax in Denmark. And they don't just pay that land tax for property they own in Denmark, they pay it for property they own outside Denmark. This isn't a problem in the Nordic Council because they share information on property ownership, but the Danish tax authorities do not know how many holiday houses in the Costa del Sol that Danish taxpayers own. And so I contacted SCAT and said, how much money do you raise from this from Danish taxpayers who own property in the UK? And the answer was somewhere in the region of we've 58 Danish taxpayers paying, I don't know, 500,000 Danish crowns or something. And I went back and said, I think you've probably got more than 58 Danish taxpayers living in one borough of London alone, never mind the whole of the UK. And by the way, there's 400,000 acres of land in Scotland owned by Danish citizens. And if you want to go into some kind of profit-sharing arrangement, I can help you with that. At which point, they cut off correspondence with me. But we do have a man called Anders Paulsen, who's a billionaire, Danish billionaire, who owns now probably more land than the Duke of Buccleuch. He's buying up land in Scotland, and I'm sure he's paying his green tax. And if he is paying his green tax, the bizarre thing is he is the only owner of rural land in Scotland who's paid any tax on their land. And the irony is he's not paying it to Highland Council or to Scottish Borders Council, he's paying it to Esbjerg Commune to build beautiful kindergartens for the children in Esbjerg. And that's the kind of irrationality we've got in our tax system. Other things we looked at, I was a special advisor to the House of Commons Scottish Affairs Committee and on land reform. We looked at things like the conditional exemption on heritage tax, where big landowners don't have to pay inheritance tax if they allow you to visit their castles and walk on their land, etc. Agricultural inheritance relief and inheritance tax for farmers. In the 1950s, they got complete exemption from non-domestic rates. So you can be in a small village in Scotland and the butcher, the baker and the candlestick maker are all paying pretty hefty non-domestic rates bills. Meanwhile, just outside town, there's a millionaire farmer paying absolutely nothing. This is utterly bizarre. So to conclude, I think what we do need to do, we have the possibility to do it because it's the beginning of a 5-year parliament, and all the things that make politicians feel it's very difficult to deal with tax, particularly things like the council tax, where there's 2.4 million households for whom this is very salient because they get billed through the door, it's not just taken off their payslips. This is the time to do it. And yet simple things like a revaluation. The SNP said, we're not going to do this during this parliament. So I said to them, well, when are you going to do it? Because you don't do it in the lead up to an election. So you're not going to do it in the lead up to the next election. So how long are we going to wait for this? If people are paying tax, I've got constituents here in Leith who are paying tax on property that's now worth, in Band E, are going to get a tax hike in April, and they're paying, then their property is worth less than Band B properties in Leith Walk. That's because since 1991, tenement flats up and down around here have risen in value more than the kind of rubbish 90s flats that were thrown up, which my poor constituent lives, which have fallen in value because they're crap. We knew it then, but there was a boom on. And this is fundamentally unfair. If we did income tax like this, as I frequently say, Nicola Sturgeon would pay no tax at all because she was a student in 1991, and that kind of seems to be bizarre. So what do we want to do? We laid out quite a comprehensive programme of tax reform in our manifesto, arguing for things like a shift from incomes to wealth, which I think is fundamental, and particularly a shift to the local to re-empower local government. So modern land and property tax systems should be based on transparency, fairness, progressiveness, and there's no reason why they can't be designed along modern principles. You could, for example, in Turkey, you can sit in a cafe and you can sell your house over your mobile phone. You can pay your taxes over your mobile phone. In Norway, for example, everyone's income tax is up on the website. You can see how much tax everyone pays. I publish my annual tax return. I think everyone should. But this Parliament is the opportunity to transform tax. I sincerely hope it does, but I have absolutely no confidence that it will. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. We move now to an open forum, a time for us to share the collective wisdom in the room. I would say there is a roving mic, so if you've got questions, when you get the mic, speak closely into it so we can all hear you. I would also ask that let us know if it's a question or a comment. If it's a comment, keep it concise, but we do want to hear from you. If it is a question and it's directed to either of our speakers, let us know, and we'll move into that space. We have till about 10:02. So there's plenty of time for us to speak. So if you have a question, please raise your hand. I'm also trying to make sure that there's a gender balance in the questions. So raise your hands high and we'll move into questions. There's a gentleman there.
Thank you very much. This is to Richard. You mentioned we need our own currency in Scotland, but Nicola wants us to join the state in Europe, and to join Europe you have to take on the euro, which gets rid of the printing presses. What are your feelings about this?
Europe is obviously a very difficult question. I am pro staying in Europe in principle. I have deep reservations about the structure of the European Union, which is fundamentally built on the ideas of neoliberal capitalism, and that has intensely anti-people elements within it. I do not believe that Europe will impose the condition of joining the euro on every country that joins in the future. I don't believe they could. The current potential joining states could not integrate into the euro. I don't think Turkey is likely to join very soon, if ever, but I can't see it integrating into the euro, even though it's considered as a potential member state. So I think Scotland could negotiate, and I believe there will be negotiation anyway, because Scotland could negotiate a non-currency membership. After all, the precedents exist. Denmark is the obvious one, but so is Sweden. And I do believe Scotland, if it was to actually become independent, but then apply for membership, the European Union should say yes, but with our own currency. And I actually think that Europe will probably accept that now. I think there's so much which is going to be negotiated on Europe in the next few years because they realise the model is so not working, including the euro, that everything will be up for grabs.
Andy, did you want? Next, we got a gentleman there and then.
Thanks very much for both your comments. One of the bigger studies of tax, the Murphy report, said that the biggest problem was the lack of political will amongst political parties. I mean, do you agree, and what can be done about this? Because particularly the comments on wealth and property being made so often, and yet so little is being done.
Chris, is that directed to either or
To both.
to both? And
Well, indeed, there's much in the Murray's review that I don't agree with, but in a broad sense, it was a very, very useful and eloquent analysis of the British tax system and its failings and how it might be improved. And Chapter 16 on property taxation, although again there's bits in there I disagree with, again is eloquently argued, and it's an education for people to read it. Geez, we're turning out Saturday morning to talk tax, and I'm advocating reading the thousand pages. So your question, the political will, I mean, this is a difficult one because we're in an era of retail politics. So as I said, the reason a big party like the SNP defending a majority in the Scottish Parliament of seats, if not votes, and hoping to form the next government, did not want to be facing hustings like this, which it would have, had it boldly said it was going to do something transformative like scrap council tax and reintroduce a new kind of property tax, because everyone would say, well, what am I going to be? And then even when they got the answer, they wouldn't have believed it. And for a big political party that's wanting power, that's a really difficult situation to get yourself into, so you simply avoid it. But what I think we need to do, and what I tried to do before the election, was speak to the other political parties and say, look, we have a broad agreement on this commission. Can we all reach an agreement before the election to a suite of principles? We can then collectively go into the election, not arguing about those principles, but saying these are the principles we believe in. And we'll have an argument about some of the detail, and that's fine, but not about the principles. And we could have done that, and then that would have neutralised the political difficulties because there would have been nowhere else to turn. Now, the danger then is a party emerges from the left field and says we're going to scrap the council tax, you're going to pay nothing. But so that's the central challenge of this Parliament, is to get parties to sit together and work out a better way forward. It's not just tax. I mean, it's things like the future of the health service. We had an argument today, this week in Parliament, on the latest Audit Scotland report on the health service, which is a shocking indictment of the health service in Scotland. But again, the profound narrative is, well, we're spending more, we want to spend more. Yeah, we need to spend some more on health, but actually the goal in 10 years should be to be spending less on the National Health Service, because it's not a health service, it's a sickness service. And the whole idea of what's technically called preventative spending is the key. Give people warm, secure homes, boost their incomes by having more affordable homes so they can afford decent food, transform the way we do food, get rid of air pollution, provide free public transport, do all the things that enable people to lead healthier lives, and you should be able legitimately to aim to reduce the spending. That should be one of government's targets, to reduce spending. But you won't hear many politicians say that.
Would it be possible to use the standing mic?
Okay. Yeah.
Very movie that. Just use the standing mic and stand at it. Stand at it. Stand at it.
I'll stand at it. Go on. I'm married to a general practitioner, a GP, and she'd agree entirely with what Andy said. She reckons that I do more for health in the UK than she can ever do. She also has diagnosed me with a condition which she calls excitement by taxation. She thinks I'll die with it, but not of it. I agree with you entirely. The problem is political will. I mean, I saw this very realistically. You know, I told you that Jeremy Corbyn tried to adopt me, and in August last year, I seemed to be in an awful lot of media. The Guardian profiled me 4 times last year. That's ridiculous. And I did the Today programme and heaven knows what else, including media up here and so on. And that was because actually John and Jeremy had no idea what they were going to do about the economy, let's be honest, and they still don't, if I'm completely honest. And they let me talk. And we challenged things. I challenged things and put forward some radical suggestions. And I think it helped Jeremy Corbyn get elected, to be totally honest. But since then, they haven't done it because they've been frightened. They're frightened of the most stupid things. I mean, one obvious thing to do in this country is simply abolish inheritance tax. Why? Because it's only paid by a small group of middle-class people. Actually, they make a massive noise about it. The wealthiest don't pay for the reasons that Andy's already described. They own agricultural land, or they have so much money they can invest all their wealth in shares on the secondary London Stock Exchange, the AIM market. Do you know if you put your shares in the secondary AIM market, you don't pay inheritance tax because you're deemed to be an entrepreneur. So you can avoid all inheritance tax. Now, you won't do that. You'll look totally shocked. It's so easy to do, to avoid a inheritance tax. It's a ridiculous tax. What do? We create a capital gains tax on death. What do we include in the capital gains tax based on death? Domestic houses. Why? Because actually, you'd only have it on the second death in a partnership. You know, a first person can leave their property to a second person if they're married or in a civil partnership for capital gains tax and not pay capital gains tax. When the second person dies, do you know what? They don't need the house anymore. They're dead. It's very simple. I argue this on radio sometimes. I appear quite regularly on the Jeremy Vine show on BBC Radio 2. And there's all these people who say, oh, but we've got to leave the family home to the next person in the family. Well, I'll tell you, my dad's 90. If I'd been hanging around waiting for Dad to die, I'd be one, pretty sad, and two, I certainly wouldn't have had a family of my own. Yeah, just ridiculous argument. So there is this complete capture of politics by stupid narrative. And it's narrative building that we need to do. And it's actually talking about sensible things like, why is capital gains tax at 18% and income tax at up to 45%? Why do we have, apparently, this narrative of the skivers and the strivers, when actually the strivers, according to George Osborne, are paying at 18% of the skivers? We tax labour highly and we tax capital lowly. We have to reverse all those narratives. Then we will empower those timid, frightened politicians to do something. But at the moment, they are completely frightened of the media who put out these stories about the dreadful burden of taxation. And you can change the narrative. Can I be clear about that? We've done that in the tax justice movement. We really did. One of the ways we did that was actually tax havens was a really problematic word when we came to negotiating with governments. Because havens sound like wonderful things, the next step to heaven. So we renamed them. In 2009, I read a paper saying they're secrecy jurisdictions. And secrecy is a bad thing. Economically, it's a bad thing, and it's bad for taxation. Over 50% of all references in international negotiations now about tax havens refer to secrecy jurisdictions because we've changed the narrative. That word made it possible to go against secrecy and demand transparency. We just have to build this. But politicians won't change it. It's down to society to change it, us to change it, you to change it.
See several hands in there. I'm going to go to the woman in the green jumper, and just to say the roving mic has decided to pack in.
No, it's not.
Oh, is it not? We're back on target. She's right here. Okay. And then I've seen two or three different hands. Yes. We're going to hear from this woman first. Yes, please.
Thank you very much. It's really interesting. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
A few questions, particularly talking about havens, and this is really interesting, talking about our attitude to tax. As you can probably hear, I come from the Republic of Ireland, and that is a country that has a very strange relationship with tax and tax authorities. But what I wanted to ask you is, where are there any countries in the world that are, okay, nobody is perfect in terms of how tax is done in a more fair and equitable way, but you did mention there are countries that are doing it well. Where are the kind of models that we can aspire to?
And was that to a particular person, or was that?
Well, to both Richard and
Thank you.
I was in Bratislava 10 days ago, invited by the European presidency, which Slovakia have right now, addressing a conference on this sort of issue. And the Irish were there, and I had the advantage of having both an Irish and an English or British passport. So I made it clear that A, I was staying in Europe, whatever happened on Brexit, and B, that I thought this gave me a right to address the Irish diplomat present, about whom apparently I was not very diplomatic. So I was advised, and I said, I don't care. Ireland is engaged in tax warfare with the rest of the world. Let's not talk about tax competition. This is another change in narrative we need to use. There is no such thing as tax competition because all competition is predicated on the idea that you can fail. And I really don't think we should tolerate the idea of failed states, which is the outcome of tax competition. tax competition is all about failed states and winning corporations. I'm sorry, I don't accept the notion that we should be transferring power of states to corporations. So Ireland is a particularly bad state in this sense, and I'm pretty unpopular in Ireland for saying so. I do so quite often. I even argue that 12.5% is actually replacing the half in the middle of the Irish trickle, the idea of the nation state. And I've said that on RTE, because nobody from Ireland would say it. I've got the right name at least, come on. Are there places that do it well? I'm afraid we have to go back to Scandinavia. If you want to find better tax systems, Scandinavia clearly has got it. And they've done some things which we would think to be quite unusual. So, for example, they have high VAT rates. Their VATs are higher than 20%, most are 25%. And they actually also charge VAT on a lot of things that we don't charge VAT on. Books, for example, are subject to VAT in Scandinavia. And you just think, oh, that's horrendous. And then you realise that the reason why they charge that high tax is because they have enormous benefit systems. And so people, one of my colleagues at Copenhagen Business School, I do quite a lot of work at Copenhagen. In fact, it's my exit route for Brexit, I'm afraid to say. I've been offered a job in Copenhagen. If the worst comes to the worst, that's where I'm going, which I'm pretty pleased about, to be totally honest. But, yeah, as a dad, he's had 6 months paternity leave. Because it's not 2 weeks, which is what a dad would get here if it's they're on the secondary level of, we could swap here, but everybody gets that sort of allowance. The benefit systems are extraordinary. They've integrated benefits and taxation. And that's, again, something we need to think about, because they talk about social policy and tax and how we integrate the systems together much more than we have. The other thing they do better than us is they actually tax businesses more fairly. We do it very badly. Andy asked me, are there some things that Scotland should be doing? Well, I'll tell you one thing Scotland should be doing right now. Scotland hasn't prosecuted a single company director for failure to file accounts or a corporation tax return since 2008. Why? There are tens of thousands of companies in Scotland who don't file corporation tax returns and accounts with the registrar of companies. There's a separate Scottish register and there have been no prosecutions, because nobody's bothered to do it. But that is a license for tax abuse in Scotland, and yet you're not doing anything about it. The Scottish Parliament needs to demand power over the Scottish Register of Companies and to pursue that. And Scotland needs to get rid of the Scottish Limited Partnership, which is one of the strongest mechanisms for tax haven abuse around the world right now, and which actually was used to steal 1/8 of the GDP of Moldova. Scotland is partly a tax haven because of failure to address Scottish company law issues. So we're doing it badly. Overall, if you want an example of how to do it, go to Scandinavia. There is a good book on this. I would recommend it. It's called Viking Economics. It was written by a Quaker, George Leahy, who's at Swarthmore University in the States. Highly readable, great way of accessing ideas on how economics is done in Scandinavia.
Okay. Right. We have 5 questions, so I've got 5. So I'm going to ask both our speakers to be concise, and I'll try to get through those 5. First is this gentleman who's been waiting very patiently.
My name is Steve Ray from Prof Richard Murphy. I talk to David Steve Ray from Dunfermline. My question is about agricultural land. We depend on our survival on prime agricultural land, and yet what do you see? The Dunfermline Eastern Expansion, prime farmland covered with toy town houses, and along the line of the Great North Road at Winchborough, prime farmland plastered with toy town houses, yet over the hill there are those tips waiting to be covered in houses, levelled and put houses on. How can we stop the blight of wrecking our heritage, our food production system, by the toy town houses covering Scotland? Are there any fiscal mechanisms to prevent any more encroachment of agricultural land by these hideous toy town houses that last only 50 years?
Thank you. Andy?
Okay, well, this is, all the arguments I've made about tax would apply to your toy town houses, but actually this is more fundamental than that, and it's going off script a little bit on the tax thing. But we have a planning bill coming through the Parliament, going to be coming through the Parliament this time round. One of the principal reasons you see crap toy town houses being built. 90%, over 90% of Britain's new housing is built by volume house builders. So again, if you take away something here, I mean, I want to eliminate the volume house building industry. Just eliminate it. Because it makes most of its profits on land, because it competes for land in the first instance. And that means the amount of money it's got left to build good quality houses is squeezed. And its balance sheet is full of risk, because it's full of the risk of the land, it's full of the risk of the construction, and it's full of the risk of actually getting any buyers. And that's why actually they're very risk averse, and that's when there's an economic downturn, they simply stop building houses. And one of the key ways to stop this is the 1947 Town Country Planning Act. We let local authorities buy land at existing use value, because we were introducing the idea that you should apply to a public authority for permission to use your land the way you wanted to. Prior to that, you could use the land, you could build a house without asking anybody. After we nationalised land use, you had to ask a public authority for permission to build the house up to anything else, a factory, etc. And part of the consequence of that was, of course, land prices rose where you got permission. So typically a field of agricultural land would be worth £5,000 a hectare with permission for housing is worth 5 million. And in our system, in our planning system and in our tax system, we just hand that to the landowner. And yet it's us that's gifted it. Now, we had a system where you could buy it at existing use value. We also imposed that system on Germany because both countries were reconstructing after the war. And the idea that we should actually gift valuable betterment, as it was called, or uplift in land values to landowners when we had a massive job to do to rebuild the country, Germany had an even bigger one, was complete nonsense. But in the Tory government in 1959, they got it scrapped. So landowners got that uplift back. And in the 1962 Land Compensation Act, we put it into statute. Germany never did that. And that's the reason in Germany today, municipalities buy land at existing use value, they master plan it to a very, very high degree, and they put in services, and then people buy plots, no more than 2 plots per person. And you've got a mix of individuals, companies, social housing, people, and all the rest of it. You buy a plot for €20,000, you then jump in your car and drive around Lower Saxony visiting a range of German building companies, all of whom are competing with you, the procurer of the house, for a high quality house that will last forever, that's as large as you can, will cost nothing to run, it's energy efficient. So those are the competitive pressures in the German house building industry. The competitive pressures in the so-called Scottish house building industry are to get as much land as they can as cheap as possible and throw up as many houses as they can before anyone notices. And the result is we're building stuff that's actually going to be falling down in 40 years. So that would be a key reform. There are many, many other reforms. But I mean, on prime agricultural land, sometimes you do have to take prime agricultural land, but not always. In Edinburgh here, the waterfront is meant to have 10,000 new houses. It hasn't. The land there is sitting derelict and idle and vacant and is now in the hands of companies based in secrecy jurisdictions in the British Virgin Islands and Grand Cayman. In our planning policy, we say that local authorities must have a 5-year land supply for projected housing demand. One of the criteria for judging whether a piece of land is appropriate for that is obviously, is it appropriate? If it's a bog, obviously you can't put it in your 5-year land supply. But one of the criteria is ownership. Is the owner willing and in a position to bring it forward as the language to develop it? Well, you make a judgment on that. Clearly, 7 years after the financial crash, 8 years after the financial crash, these companies in the British Virgin Islands are not going to do building any houses down at the waterfront. So it's come out the 5-year land supply. So where do we go now? We go out to the Greenbelt. So this is the madness at the heart. And this is, again, we're not going to talk about housing, right? But I mean, it is intimately related to tax. But this is the one area where we could have a transformative approach in the Scottish Parliament that would make housing more affordable, higher quality, in the better place, and would last forever, and it would cost nothing to run, because the technology there is to build houses now that cost nothing to heat. But our current house building model, our current taxation model, critical to that, doesn't do it. If you improve your house to high energy standards, the next time you sell it, you'll go up a council tax ban. That's bizarre. That's why we argue for a property tax based purely on the site value, on the land. We don't want to discourage people from improving property, but we do. We do it with businesses as well. Businesses improve the property, the non-domestic rates get hiked. We want them to improve their property.
A very quick response. Scotland should have a development land tax. So that capture, the increase in value, the moment that the planning permission is given, should be captured for the benefit of the state. Who gave that gain? Right now, it will be taxed in the company at 20% at most. Why not have a development land tax at least 80%? So most of that is captured for local advantage to build the infrastructure that will go with the housing if you have to build on whatever site it is. And, of course, have a land value tax that would stop companies in the British Virgin Islands sitting on piles of land for a long time.
Thank you. Here is my
Just need some political will.
here is my list, and I want to make sure that if there's anybody else who wants to ask a question, they can. So, woman in the back, and then we have gentleman in the check shirt in the front. There's a man in the check shirt in the back, and then there is one in the front. But is there anyone else who would like to ask a question? And you go on my list. Oh gosh.
Why don't we do questions and then let's see if we've got time for answers.
We'll take we'll take 2 or 3 questions at a time because we're moving on. And so we've got woman in the back, gentleman, man in the check shirt. Right? Yes. Somebody who had your hand up earlier.
Gone.
Gone. Gave up. Okay. There's a man in the back with the check shirt, and then there's a man in the front with the check shirt.
Just thought. Yes.
Question for Andy. Again, bring the microphone closer.
Speak up a little bit.
Bring the
Yes.
microphone closer.
Microphone closer.
Right.
Question for Andy.
There.
Yes, and when we talk about tax, we tend to think we need a living tax. As you say, it's been for a couple of 100 years. It's seen as generally perceived as fair because it redistributes and smooths out things. Surely we should be not considering about smoothing anything out after the event. We should be stopping the great disparities at source. And the source of grazing is, of course, the monopoly of natural resources, i.e. land. Do you think, Andy, there's any sense of moving among your colleagues in Parliament towards the collection of economic rent as the way of replacing or disposing of other forms of taxation, particularly taxation on ignorance and VAT, which are quite destructive and have disincentive effects? Is there any suggestion in your talk the narrative in that direction?
Thank you. And we've got a man here at the front and woman on the opposite side.
Thanks very much. 20 years ago, when I set up my business, I went to get an accountant, and of course, most of the discussion with the accountant was how he could avoid paying tax on my behalf. So this is, and of course, when I said, no, I don't want you to do that, I want to pay my taxes, I established a relationship with him where I was the weird one. And so, we've got this culture of where all the professions exist to avoid taxation. We've got Philip Green, never mind BHS, the owner of Topshop and Topman. All his assets are in his wife's name, and they live in Monaco. So when Theresa May says we're going to crack down on these people, I mean, everything's within the law. So what can ordinary people like us do to exert pressure on actually changing the legal acceptance, the societal acceptance of tax avoidance? And a quick question for Andy is, if there's going to be a big vote on something coming up this week, what do you need everybody in this room to do to write to their MSP to ask them to vote in a particular way?
Thank you. Thank you very much. And woman.
Hi. Hello.
Yep.
So there's something about how change is so difficult and the anxiety.
Speak up a bit. Yeah.
So it's how to implement changes and how to manage the anxiety about the media response. And I'm just wondering about if there can be a lot of shared views on tax reform or structural reform, but the political will being that people get anxious. And I wondered in Nordic countries what their relationship is with the media and what role the media have, and how they've created a culture that supports the underlying all of this. I think there's probably a really strong shared view, but it kind of gets attacked with the media narratives, which are driven by a very small number of very wealthy people.
Thank you.
And I just wondered how they manage that in Nordic countries.
Three very good questions. So one in regards to income tax and economic rent, one talking about the culture of avoidance and how we counter that, and a very similar question about the rhetoric that's going on and how, again, we implement change in that area. So, Andy, and then...
Very briefly on economic rent. There's a tiny, tiny little glimmer of hope in the sense that the SNP is talking about land value tax for derelict land. And I think that's the problem, is that a lot of politicians and other political parties just see land value tax as a tax on land. And they still think land as just like bare stuff without property on it. But beyond that, there's no conversation at all. There's very, very little intelligent analysis of fiscal affairs in the Scottish Parliament. There just isn't. And it's got to improve. And one of this ties to this latest question here. One of the ways that has to improve is by people outside Parliament being much, much bolder and much more demanding. I sat down with someone the other day to talk about what the issue was, but it was an issue which their charity is concerned with. And the government's currently writing a strategy for their sector. And I said, why don't you write the strategy? I said, well, we wrote the strategy that would, create tensions with the civil service, and we have to work together with them. And I said, but yeah, they're serving government, and government is accountable to Parliament, and we're accountable to you. So one of the things I did 3 weeks ago in the council tax thing was write my own statutory instrument. Now, if you're going to come out Saturday morning and talk about tax, writing your own statutory instrument is really getting geeky. But the important thing of that is I met the senior civil servant. So in other words, this is stuff that Parliament could do now that was way beyond what the SNP is doing. I met the civil servant in Waverley Station who's in charge of all this and that. He said, I was really interested in your statutory instrument. I said, well, thank you very much. And he said, but you missed out section 93. I said, well, do you mean what does section 93 do? And he told me, I said, okay, that's fine, so I should have put that in. But what was interesting about that is that got into the heart of the civil service, because they will read somebody else's attempt at statutory instrument, somebody else's attempt at a law, somebody else's attempt at a strategy. And what that also does, it gives parliamentarians something of a gold standard. So the Scottish Association of Mental Health draft a mental health strategy that is, world standard and all the rest of it. And then government spends 6 months producing their own. We can compare them when government comes out. If they don't do that and it comes out, we're then left arguing with it, trying to amend it, by which time government's had 6 months to line up all its arguments about why we can't do this and why we are doing that. That's not the way democracy should work. So another takeaway is those of you who are engaged in organisations, be much more demanding, be much, much bolder, and write your own damn laws. And I don't mean every comma and dot every I and cross every T. I mean just the outline. Say this part should do this part should do this part should do this part should do this. And again, go as far as you can. Tax avoidance, what should ordinary people do? I haven't a clue, maybe Richard will help me that one. How to inform change? Well, I've just outlined one thing, and I think people need to get more engaged in just small things that typify big things. So, for example, the vote next week on council taxes, probably not a lot of people can do to engage externally on that, simply because it's a vote on a statutory instrument, you can't amend it. But get engaged. If you want to see proper transformation in public services and the way that local government works in the lead up to the elections next year in May, organise hustings for local councillors. They seldom happen. Place demands on them. And above all, write and communicate with parliamentarians about reform in the tax system. Whatever it is you want to see, whether it's the council tax scrapped or whether it's a higher top rate of income tax, because there will be a tax resolution going through early next year on the top rate of income tax. We advocated a 60% tax rate on income. And the Scottish government says, oh, people will run away to England if you pay that. There are some risks associated with that, but one of the biggest things a decent top rate of tax does is it inhibits excessive pay demands. It's one of the best ways you can do to grow it, to increase inequality. If you have a 100% tax rate on incomes above £150,000, there's no incentive for anyone to argue for more money, and that's more money to employ people on lower wages. So it's a no-brainer. The government has an advisor. She's called Naomi Eisenstadt. She's the government's advisor on poverty and inequality. Read her report, Shifting the Curve. It was published in January this year. She's doing further work. And she made an awful lot of very interesting observations. Recommendation number 9 was to be bold on local tax reform. And I'm missing no opportunity to remind the First Minister that she's signed up to all of these recommendations, and this is the one she's sitting on failing to do anything on.
Thank you.
I know we're nearly out of time, so I'm going to talk about things that you can do and not tell stories very much. Wealth. Look, Owen Smith stood for leader of the Labour Party, so he followed a familiar path and came to me and asked me to write policy for him. And I did this summer, and he declared he had got a wealth tax. Well, actually, you will discover on my blog, I do blog an awful lot, by the way, that there is a whole paper on wealth tax that I wrote, which suggests how we could raise over £40 billion from wealth taxation. He chose the tiniest little part of it, which was an investment income surcharge on people earning over $150,000 a year, where they pay 15% extra tax on their investment income. No, we should do that for everybody who's got investment income over $10,000 a year. Why? Because they don't pay any national insurance if they earn their income from wealth rather than from employment. Therefore, there's a complete bias in our system against working, as I said before, for labour rather than for wealth. So an investment income surcharge isn't an extra tax, it's just trying to make up some of the difference. So wealth taxation has to be a key component of future taxation, but political will, same question, doesn't come up. Owen Smith ran away from it as well. The tax profession, look, I'm going to talk about a number of things. I ran a firm that would not do tax avoidance for 15 years. I was its senior partner, so I know something about this, and it was extremely commercially successful. We have lots of people who came to us because we said we won't abuse the tax system. So there is a market for clean, straight, honest accountants, but there are remarkably few of them. What you can do, there's a thing called the Fair Tax Pledge. Look it up. In there's a letter you can send to your accountant to say, don't tax avoid on my behalf and I'll sue you if you do. I helped write that one. It's a simple, straightforward thing, but don't fiddle on my behalf. What can you do? You can say to businesses you deal with, we'd like you to get the fair tax mark. It's another of my ideas. It's growing. It's not big yet, but it's growing. The fair tax mark, its biggest single company is in fact SSE, a Scottish company. It's not a perfect company. We know that. No company is perfect, but it's a Scottish company. It's the biggest single company with the fair tax mark. How do we change the narrative? So, and this is part of the same thing. Actually, phone every radio phone-in program you can when they talk about economics and about taxation and say, I like paying tax. It is the most subversive thing you can do. I do it quite often. I'm interviewed on the radio quite often. I'm like Andy. I've even written acts of parliament for fun, Andy. I've done 2 acts of parliament, but I also spend a lot of time on the radio. And I had Nick Ferrari on LBC. Do you get LBC up here? God, you're lucky. But Nick Ferrari is a grim guy to be interviewed by at 8 o'clock in the morning. And he interviewed me and he said, but nobody likes to pay tax. And I said, Nick, I love it. Couldn't believe it. Nobody had ever said on this radio station, I love paying tax. I said, why do you like paying tax? I said, it provided my education. It saved my son's life and my wife's life when we went through an incredibly difficult birth. I owe half my family's lives to one morning in the NHS. Could I honestly ever not like taxation? It cost me nothing to have those 2 in my lifestyle. And he shut up and he didn't know what to say. I said, and it pays for my children's education, and it pays for the road, and it pays for everything under the sun that I can think of. I love paying for it, because most of the valuable things in my life are paid for by the state. Now, if you just learn that narrative, you only have to make it personal to you. You can be subversive in your own right, because then politicians will hear. The more of us who say tax does good things in our lives, the easier it is for politicians to believe us and start talking about how they can deliver that well-being. It's not really hard, And you can phone into your local radio station and say that. And you don't have to be technical to say, it saved my son's life. You just have to know it's true, or whatever it was in your case.
We've come to 10:02, so I think unfortunately we'll have to close it down, but we're not closing down the conversation. That has just started. So our authors and our speakers will be out here in a minute. But what I wanted to do is, first of all, say thank you to Richard and to Andy and to Lesley, who had to leave. You have given us so much to think about, but not just to think about, go and do something about. So thank you so much for firing us up on a Saturday night. And I'd like to leave you with just another challenge. Don't just walk out of this event and say, that gave me a lot to think about. Take one thing and do it differently. Phone in a radio station. Have a go at an outline with your own law. Read Shifting Culture. Send that fair tax pledge to your accountant. There are so many things you can do. The status quo counts on our apathy. Counts on us thinking this is just too big a problem. I can't do anything about it. Rubbish. Utter rubbish. Go home, talk to your friends, get fired up, make changes. The time is now. We have a unique opportunity here. So go home and make a difference. And thank you so much for coming. It's been an utter pleasure. And thank you to the Quakers Society of Friends for holding us. Hang on 1 second. Yes. Okay, if everybody can hang on for just a second. Sorry.
Thank you very much for chairing the meeting and putting them together. Thank you for two speakers. And just to finish off, on your seats, there are keep in touch forums. If you'd like to keep in touch over this issue, please give us an email address and leave them on the front table. Thank you all very much for coming.
There's going to